Dust swirled in the dying light, the town of hollow pines holding its breath, as if the wind itself feared to pass too close to the thing in the square. The cage stood where the road met the saloon, iron bars rusted and cruel, its shadow stretching long and skeletal over the hard-packed earth. Inside, hunched against the cold bite of twilight, was the man they called a beast. Chains coiled around his wrists like snakes, rattling when he shifted. His hair fell in thick tangles across a face cut with scars, and his eyes, when they lifted, were not the eyes of a monster, but of something caught between wild and broken. Clara Whitlock stepped off the stagecoach, the hem of her faded black dress brushing against the dust. She held her satchel close, though it contained little more than a worn shawl and the silver ring that still clung to her finger like memory refusing to loosen. Whispers rose the moment her boots touched the ground. "The Whitlock widow," someone murmured. Another voice, lower, added, "still wears his ring. Still clings to ghosts." She did not meet their eyes. Grief had long taught her that small towns thrived on the weight of other people's sorrow. Her gaze caught the cage. She slowed, heart stuttering once, then again, as the figure inside shifted. He was larger than any man she'd seen, shoulders like carved timber, hands bound tight enough to bruise. His head turned, and for a breath so thin it barely existed, their eyes met. She expected savagery. What she found instead was a hollow ache so deep it seemed to reach beyond skin and bone, a silence heavier than chains. "Best keep walking, ma'am." Sheriff Boone leaned against the post, his badge glinting dull in the fading sun. He spit into the dirt and tipped his hat without warmth. "Ain't safe to stare at that one. Folks say if you look too long, you see what he's done." Clara's voice was soft, nearly a whisper. "And what has he done?" The sheriff shrugged, eyes narrowing toward the cage. "What hasn't he? Killed men in the pines. Lived off blood and bone, they say. Some claim he ain't human no more. Only thing keeping him from tearing this town apart is that iron." His words were meant to carry weight, to build walls of fear. But all Clara heard was the way the man in the cage lowered his head as though ashamed of breathing. She moved on, though her steps dragged, and all that night in the boarding house above the general store, she couldn't silence the memory of those eyes. Not feral, not empty, just tired. The kind of tired that seeped past flesh and settled in the soul. Near midnight, when the town had gone quiet except for the creak of the saloon sign and the sigh of wind through pine, Clara found herself back at the square. Lantern in hand, shawl drawn tight, she stood before the cage. The man stirred, slow and wary, the chains whispering against iron. His face lifted from the shadows, and in the dim light, she saw the rough lines of a life lived far from gentleness. Scars stitched across his jaw, a beard grown wild, but it was his eyes that held her. Not savage, not beastly, just alone. She reached into her satchel and pulled out half a crust of bread, the last she had saved from supper. Her fingers trembled as she slid it between the bars. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with a care that seemed impossible in hands so large, he reached. His fingers brushed hers, a fleeting touch, warm and calloused, and her breath caught. He took the bread without a word, holding it as though it were something precious, not stale and crumbling. Their eyes met again, and the silence between them felt like the first bridge laid over a chasm no one else dared cross. Clara stepped back, heart hammering. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was beneath the whispers and chains, but the words stuck. Instead, she turned away, the sound of him eating soft in the night. When she glanced over her shoulder, he was watching her, not like prey, not like salvation, but like a man remembering what it meant to be seen. Morning broke hard and bright. Clara stood at the counter of the sheriff's office, fingers twisting her ring. Voices from the back room cut sharp through the wooden walls. "Bounty riders are coming," a deputy said. "They'll pay good for him. Dead or alive makes no difference." Her breath hitched. Before she knew she meant to speak, she was pushing through the doorway. What if someone bought him? The room stilled. Boone turned slowly, disbelief tugging his mouth into a half-smile that wasn't kind. Buy the beast? With what, widow? You ain't got 2 nickels to rub together. Her hand shook as she slid the silver ring from her finger. It left a pale band on her skin, a ghost of touch. She set it on the table, the metal ringing small and final against the wood. With this, she said. Her voice was soft, but steady. It's all I have left of a life that's gone. Laughter cracked through the room, harsh and sharp. The deputy muttered, "She's madder than he is." Boone's smile faltered, though, his eyes lingering on the ring, on the widow standing straighter than grief should allow. "You'd trade your husband's memory for that?" he asked. Clara met his gaze without flinching. "No. I'd trade what's left of it for a man still breathing." A long beat stretched. Boone scooped up the ring, turning it over in his palm. "Fine," he said at last, voice thick with mockery and something else he didn't name. "He's yours. But if he snaps your neck, don't come crying to me." The deal was made with a signature and a sneer. When Clara stepped into the morning light, the town's eyes burned holes through her back. Whispers swirled like ash. Asterisk, the widow bought the beast. Asterisk, asterisk, she's lost her mind. Asterisk, but their words felt far away, drowned beneath the pounding of her heart as she crossed the square. The cage loomed before her, and inside, Elias Crow, though she did not yet know his name, watched her with a stillness that cut deeper than fear. The key weighed cold in her hand. The air seemed to hold its breath. She stepped close enough to smell the iron and the earth on his skin. His eyes tracked the movement of her fingers as they brushed the lock. "Not a beast," she whispered, voice barely more than air. "Not any more." The lock clicked. The chain slid loose with a sound that felt louder than thunder. His gaze lifted, and in it, for the first time, she saw not wildness, but the faintest glimmer of something aching to be free. The cage door groaned as it swung wide, the sound of iron surrendering to freedom. Elias stepped out like a creature unsure of the ground beneath him, his shoulders rolling as if the air itself were heavier beyond the bars. The cold morning light struck his face, revealing more man than monster, though the chains had left their story written in bruises across his skin. Clara stood before him, the key still warm in her hand, breath unsteady as she whispered into the brittle silence, "You're free now." Free. The words seemed to falter between them, too fragile to touch something so scarred. Elias's eyes flickered to hers, unreadable, and for a heartbeat she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Then, without a sound, he dipped his head, not in gratitude, not in submission, but something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. The town watched them go. Clara walked ahead, her black dress trailing dust, the giant shadow of the man following in her steps. Whispers tangled with the wind. Asterisk, the widow bought herself a beast. Asterisk, asterisk, won't last the night. Asterisk, she kept her gaze forward, spine straight, though her fingers clenched the shawl until her knuckles ached. Behind her, Elias moved with the uneasy grace of a man not used to walking where others could see. His silence was not empty. It pressed against her like a weight, heavy and alive. The path to her cabin wound through pines still wet with morning. The air smelled of sap and old earth, and each step felt stolen from the world they'd left behind. Clara tried to speak once, words catching in her throat. What could she ask a man who had been a rumor before he'd been a person? Her voice finally broke the quiet, small and thin. "Do you have a name?" Elias's answer came low and rough, like a stone long buried. "Crow." He hesitated, as if unused to the sound of his own voice. "Elias Crow." Clara held the name on her tongue a moment before whispering it back. Elias. It fit the man who walked behind her, solemn and worn, more human with every step away from the cage. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had burned the frost off the grass. Clara's home was small, the roof bowed under years of storms, the fence half broken. She saw it through his eyes and felt a pang of shame, but Elias only stood still, scanning the clearing as though memorizing every crooked line. When she bent to lift the water barrel by the door, her fingers slipped on the damp wood. Without a word, Elias stepped forward. His hands, those hands that had been chained like weapons, lifted the barrel with effortless care and set it upright. For the first time, Clara met his gaze without fear. Something softened in the quiet between them, the smallest fracture in the wall the world had built around him. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke and worn fabric. Clara stoked the fire, the crackle filling the silence. She caught Elias standing near the door, as if unsure if he was allowed to come further. "You can sit," she said gently. He lowered himself onto the bench, every movement deliberate, his size making the small room feel even smaller. When the fire's glow warmed the edges of the room, Clara finally asked the question that had burned since the first time she saw him. "Why did they lock you away?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then Elias's voice came, slow and raw, each word scraping against disuse. "For surviving." His hands flexed against his knees, chains long gone but remembered. "My family was killed in the mountains. I stayed. Lived alone. Trapped for winters, hunted for meat when I had to. When I came down, they saw a man they didn't understand. So they made a cage to fit their fear." Clara's throat tightened. The fire popped softly between them. "They called you a beast." Elias's eyes lifted, and in the flicker of light they looked unbearably human. "Maybe I was. When you have nothing left, the line between man and beast disappears." Her fingers curled around her knees. "You're not a beast now." He studied her then, not like a savior, not like a threat, but like someone trying to remember what it felt like to be seen. His voice was almost a whisper. "You were the first hand that didn't throw a stone." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. Clara felt something shift inside her, small and profound, like the first green sprout breaking through winter soil. Night crept in before either spoke again. The quiet was broken by the distant crunch of hooves on frost. Clara froze, head snapping to the window. The faint glint of lanterns moved through the trees. Elias's jaw tightened. "They're coming. Bounty hunters," she breathed, the echo of the sheriff's words twisting in her chest. Panic rose sharp and cold, but Elias was already standing, his massive frame tense. "I'll run." No, the word came out sharper than she meant, trembling on the edges of fear and something stronger. She stepped in front of him, palm pressed against his chest, feeling the steady drum of his heart. "You've run enough. You deserve to be seen." His eyes searched hers, the weight of years balanced in that single breath. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Clara turned toward the door just as it burst open, the bounty riders filling the threshold, guns glinting in the firelight. "Step aside, lady," one barked. "Ain't no sense dying for a beast." Clara's hands lifted, though they trembled. "He's mine," she said, her voice quiet but cutting through the air. "You'll have to shoot through me." Time slowed, the firelight flickering against their faces, the room holding its breath. Behind her, she felt Elias move, not forward but closer, his hand settling on her shoulder. The weight of it was gentle, steadying, a vow made without words. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the riders lowered his gun, uncertainty breaking through his hardened face. "That ain't no beast," he muttered. One by one, the others followed, weapons falling to their side. Sheriff Boone's voice came from behind them, ragged with something like shame. "Let them be." His eyes met Clara's, then Elias's, and for the first time, the lawman looked away. The riders turned, the sound of their retreat fading into the pines until only the fire crackled between the widow and the man she'd bought with her last memory of love. Clara exhaled, shoulders sagging, and Elias stepped back, though his hand lingered for a heartbeat longer on her shoulder before falling away. Later, as the quiet settled deep and soft, Clara sat by the fire, watching the shadows stretch across the room. Elias was outside, his silhouette against the moonlight as he repaired the broken fence with hands once bound. She touched the bare skin where her ring had been, the absence both loss and beginning. The air was still, heavy with something unspoken, and in that hush she understood. Some cages weren't made of iron. Some were made of fear. Outside, Elias paused, head turning toward the door as if he'd heard the thought. For the first time, Clara wondered, not with dread, but with a strange, fragile hope, what might happen now that both of them were free.